I want to thank everyone who's joined us tonight for the Neurosurgery and Spine Pitch Club. For those of you who have not attended before, Pitch Club is really an opportunity for some of the companies in our network to get an opportunity to engage with physicians. Of course, we do open it up to people from the industry as well as investors, but really the primary focus of this is kind of that interaction and engagement with clinicians. And so you will see that the presentation is a little bit more technical, but we're really looking to get good questions as well as feedback to help these companies as they're continuing to develop their products. So please, if you have questions, make sure you ask them. And we do ask as we present polls that you'll take a few minutes to give the companies feedback to help them. So with that, I will introduce Dr. Katie Richardson, who is our VP of Clinical Relations and will be emceeing the evening tonight.
Great, thank you so much, Jennifer. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for being here tonight. We have 3 great companies to share with you, and we are really excited to do so. So without further ado, I am going to introduce our first company of the evening, and this is Hebe Xu of SpineGuide Technologies. She is their CFO, and Hebe, you can go ahead and share your slides and get started.
Good evening, everyone. Deformity correction and maintenance of spine growth are very critical in the scoliosis treatment. The problem with current treatment strategy for patients over 10 years old is that spine growth will simply be stopped after correction and fixation. The potential growth of instrumented spine will be lost. For patients under 10 years old, growing rod is very popular. The biggest problem with option number 1 here, which is traditional growing rod, is multiple lengthening surgeries are needed and twice a year for multiple years. The problem with option number 2, which is magnetic controlled growing rod called MAGIC, is that correction outcome is not good due to 2D distraction-based correction. Here are some videos to demonstrate. This is MAGIC, the product for EOS. It applies 2D distraction to the curvature. It is very clear here that after correction, the outcome is still no good. EOS market is estimated for $500 million globally. Final fusion, which is the only step for AIS and the last step for EOS, it is commonly known that no growth after final fusion. There were about 30,000 AIS surgeries in the US alone, with a market size of $600 million. Our founder and inventor, Dr. Lee, is an orthopedic surgeon himself. He thinks that the current treatment strategies are far from being satisfactory. There was a clear unmet clinical need for treatment that provided both good correction and spine growth with fewer surgeries and less trauma. Then he invented a CurveRight system. This is a 3D multi-segment growth guidance rod to solve the problem once for all. CurveRight corrected curvature effectively in just one single surgery through its 3D correction and enables spine growth non-invasively through a socket structure with an anti-rotation mechanism. He has already spent over 11 years on this device. Let's see how it works. The correction method of CurveRight is very similar to traditional pedicle screw rod, which is both a 3D correction and provide a very good result. Connect the rod with screw and rotate the rod to correct the curvature. The deformity can be very well corrected in just one single surgery. No further correction will be needed. However, there was a very important differentiation of CurveRight. The connection parts are socket structure with an anti-rotation mechanism. This structure is locked when twisted, but extendable when stretched. In this way, spine will grow non-invasively under the guidance of the device. Compared with other growth-friendly devices, our device provides much better correction and avoid multiple surgeries. Dr. Lee has performed over 33 ship surgeries. He has already published preliminary data on spine in 2015. Today, we're going to share with you some unpublished data from 2016. So first, he built a large animal scoliosis model with CurveRight. Secondly, he corrected the curved spine with CurveRight. Lastly, after 6 months, he found a clear gap right here, which shows the instrumented spine was growing. This data was very convincing to him that CurveRight can change the curvature of spine and maintain the spine growth at the same time. Those data are also very highly appreciated by key opinion surgeons in the world, including Dr. Akabania and Dr. Sponsler. In fact, Dr. Akabania was so impressed that he immediately introduced Dr. Lee to NuVasive. Professor Hansen Yuan, who is also a legendary in the spine industry, he has guided Dr. Lee's research in the past 9 years. We have also showed this data to FDA during our Q-Sub meeting last year. They confirmed that our model is very effective and no further animal study will be needed before human study. We only need a study of 15 to 20 patients for EOS 510(k) approval. Dr. Lee launched the company SpineGuide in 2018, and he has been fully committed to the company full-time since then. SpineGuide has become one of the first 30 residents at JLab Shanghai in 2019. Our R&D and first-in-human study are fully self-funded. IRB has already approved our first-in-human study. We might have our first patient enrollment next month. We are currently raising about $2 million to achieve IDE approval in the US. Based on our continuous dialogue with J&J and Medtronic, which both are very promising, we might have an early exit or potential partnership between our Series B round funding. We are here today to seek pilot partners in the US and medical and business advisors. We believe that CurveRight will change the paradigm of scoliosis treatment. And today we invite you to be part of it. Thank you very much.
Hebe, thank you so much for sharing with us about SpineGuide. This is really exciting. Clearly, as a pediatrician, scoliosis treatment is something that I talk to patients about not infrequently. I have a couple of questions to get us started, but for those of you who are in the audience, please put some questions in the Q&A. We would love to take questions from you as well. So you mentioned that you were able to create a scoliosis model in young sheep with your product, with the SpineGuide product. Tell me more about why that's important.
Yes. CurveRight is the only device that can make the straight spine to curved spine and then turn the curved spine to a straight spine in the whole time still maintaining growth. And secondly, FDA confirmed that only the straight curve model will be enough. No more additional animal study is needed for any before the human study.
That's fantastic. So again, able to move through some of these studies quicker because you don't have to do additional animal studies.
Yes.
Well, and one other thing that you said that I found to be very exciting, you said that you are in continuous dialogue with some US-based manufacturers. So tell me more about that.
Yeah, as I mentioned, we are a JLab resident in Shanghai, and we are in discussion with both J&J China and the US on a regular basis. In the meantime, we are also on the NDA with Medtronic, and they are very eager to see how our first-in-human data come out.
Very good. I'm going to ask some questions from our audience here tonight. The first one, most adolescents that require surgery for scoliosis have significant curvature of the spine. Without pedicle fixation across all of the involved levels, will it be possible to fully correct the curve, or will the construct be too weak to maintain the correction?
Well, this is a very technical question, but I will try to answer to my best. And if it's not satisfactory, we can always set up a separate conversation with our founder, Dr. Lee. Yeah, as I mentioned, we are 3D correction. The correct way is very similar to traditional pedicle school. So in this way, we are very similar. So the simple answer is yes, we are strong enough.
Fantastic. And there's another question. Have you considered a partnership with 2D, 3D low dose imaging company in the area of pediatrics for EOS? One of the biggest issues in pediatric spine is exposure of children to radiation. Very true. And this particular person says, I would imagine a better clinical method in conjunction with low dose radiation may be a win-win across the board.
I think that's a very excellent suggestion. To my knowledge, we haven't really think about that until, but we can certainly consider that and have a separate conversation.
Fantastic. And I know we have one other question from our audience about what Dr. Lenke in the US thinks about this approach. And I'm guessing Dr. Lee probably knows Dr. Lenke. And so again, we will follow up with the opportunity to speak with Dr. Lee on that question. I do have one final question for you, Hebe.
Yes.
What are the other benefits of your product over the existing growth rods that are on the market?
Yeah, I would add 2 additional points. One is normal final fusion means huge saving to the entire healthcare system, and also significant improvement to the patient's quality of life. Secondly, for the biggest challenge actually to MAGiC is debris. And Dr. Lee has already come up with the solution to minimize or we can show you a picture here. This is the debris problem which MAGiC currently having. And this is the improvement Dr. Lee has already come up with. Let's look at the 2016 version. We can see no more debris under the microscope, which we will include this feature in our 2nd generation of technology.
Fantastic. And I'm sure Dr. Lee would be happy to talk more about that as well. Again, thank you so much, Hebe, for being here tonight and for sharing SpineGuide's revolutionary scoliosis technology with us. It's very exciting.
Okay, thank you very much.
So thanks for the intro, Katie. And I'd also like to mention that co-founder Dr. Todd Alleman, an orthopedic spine surgeon and professor at Stanford, is on as well. He was having bandwidth issues, so you're stuck with me presenting. I'm actually the COO. We also have our CEO, Richard Treadwell, who's in the audience as well. So we are Empirical Spine. We make the Limbaflex paraspinous tension band that we'll be presenting today. So as we even saw from the last presentation, the spine is a really amazing, incredibly complex organ that 3 main things it does is it supports our body weight, it protects the spinal cord and the nerve roots, and then it moves in very complex planes. And despite doing all these things, we kind of take it for granted. One of the main tools in the belt of a spine surgeon is a lumbar spinal fusion, and they're very effective for several different diseases, in particular the one that we're pursuing, but there are complications that are associated with them. In this one, we can see this patient's developed degeneration of the adjacent segments. So the disc, which starts out healthy at A, about 15 months later in C, has lost disc height, and eventually this patient moved on to extending their fusion another level, which is a fairly life-changing operation. The disease that we're focusing on is degenerative spondylosis, and unlike several other diseases of the lumbar spine, it is very easy to diagnose. Insurance companies all recognize it, and it's very easy to see here, where you can tell that the L4 vertebrae is slipped forward over the L5. There's an offset here at the back of the vertebrae. And there's, along with this deformity, there's an associated dynamic instability where when the spine bends forward in flexion and back in extension, there's often an increased range of motion. And this is associated with several very common degenerative processes of the spine that we're all going to experience to varying degrees throughout our life. The symptoms of degen spondy are associated with spinal stenosis, which is compression of the nerve roots from those hypertrophic pathologic degenerative tissues around the spinal segment. These symptoms result in the compressed nerve roots create radiating pain that radiates from the back, typically across the buttocks, down the hip and the legs. That's worse when you're standing and walking and gets better in flexion or sitting. And again, it's caused by these tissues compressing the nerve roots. So the standard of care treatments today, we feel are a bit inadequate, although otherwise fairly effective. So the first thing that's done is a decompression, often called a laminectomy. And in the decompression, the surgeon resects the tissue that is compressing the nerve roots. And this will directly relieve the neurologic symptoms that the patient has sought treatment for. But because of the deformity and the instability, study after study has shown that these patients do better with a decompression and a fusion at the same time. And so that's why this is the dominant standard of care, because it has the best outcomes for this disease. And it's the most common reason for a lumbar spinal fusion. There's about 140,000 a year in the US alone, growing to likely with the aging population about 300,000 a year over the next 10 years. So the fusion stabilizes the deformity and the instability. And it's been shown over and over in several studies that it's necessary to do this to prevent instability, symptom reoccurrence, and ultimately a reoperation because the symptoms have come back. But fusion it's a pretty invasive procedure. There are risks of complications. We mentioned adjacent segment degeneration is one. It's a costly procedure with a long 6-month recovery. And we mentioned the adjacent segment degeneration. So here you can see a patient in our trial that's already exhibiting a little bit of hypermobility. The patient's otherwise doing well, but you can see some hypermobility at the segment above the fusion. So what we propose is to stabilize the segment with our Limbaflex device. So there's a routine decompression, just as a surgeon would perform, and they've been trained to do in their fellowships. And that will relieve the neurologic pain and symptoms. And then through the same incision that the decompression was done, the Limbaflex device is looped around the spinous processes, and it stables the spine specifically in forward bending or the flexion plane of motion. And here you can see the animation in the top right. So we're stabilizing the spine, but still allowing an anatomic amount of motion. It's very cost effective versus fusion. It's a faster discharge with an easier recovery and very compatible as an outpatient procedure. Most of the patients in our trial, many of them were done in an ambulatory surgery setting. The instrumentation takes about 15 minutes to implant versus an hour and a half for a fusion. And these patients, they do have degenerative pathology of their spine. So it can often happen that something else will go on, a discectomy or degeneration at other segments unrelated to their original problems. And so if the patient needs further interventions in their spine, it's much easier to work around than fusion hardware and bone graft that's already there. So we have an ongoing IDE study that the study design was approved by FDA several years ago. It's fully enrolled and we're in follow-up right now, expecting to submit our primary endpoint data to the FDA around the end of the year. And these are really the key outcomes that will drive the success of the trial. So the Oswestry Disability Index is a measure of a patient's disability. The higher they are, the more disabled they are. So both the green Limbaflex group and the control fusion group started about the same, but you can see a dramatic and faster increase in the Limbaflex patients. So they've recovered much faster and gained that much of their life back earlier, whereas the fusion patients are doing very well also. These are both very good outcomes, which we're proud of that our control group is doing well also. But you can see the Limbaflex patients typically recover faster, and that's durable out to the primary endpoint at 2 years. And the differences are becoming significant. Now, in the success of the trial, we have a composite clinical success endpoint, and the most sensitive criterion of that endpoint is a 15-point improvement on this disability scale. So these represent the proportion of patients that have had a 15-point improvement on their disability score at various follow-up intervals. So again, you can see a much higher, 80% of the Limbaflex patients at 6 weeks are already showing that clinically significant amount of improvement. And that increases and is maintained out to 2 years follow-up. And these are significant numbers of well over 100 patients at 2 years follow-up. Perioperatively, there's several advantages as well. 2/3 of the Limbaflex patients have been discharged the same day. And again, this makes it a very ASC compatible procedure, which is a really big trend in the whole, in all of the surgical markets and orthopedic and spine in particular, because these have historically been big inpatient procedures. And so both the healthcare systems, the payers, and the providers and the surgeons are looking for ways that they can move these surgeries into an ASC where the surgery is often safer, there's lower rates of infection, and they cost less. So 57 out of our 140 Limbaflex patients had their procedure in an ASC setting, and they were all discharged from the ASC, which is really important from a safety standpoint. You don't want to have to admit a patient from the ASC to the hospital. We didn't have any of those. You can see most of the Limbaflex procedures were between 1 and 2 hours, where fusion, even in a minimally invasive approach, is a much lengthier procedure. And minimally invasive techniques have come a long way in terms of reducing perioperative morbidity and improving patient recovery, but it's a very technically demanding procedure that can take a long time. Hospital stay, you can see that 2/3 of our patients, as we mentioned, were discharged the same day, and nearly all of the ASC patients, except for one that was in an ASC that had a 23-hour admitting capability, they all went home the same day. The other patient went home the next morning, whereas fusion is typically about a 3-night inpatient procedure. We've seen really low complication rates in both groups. One of the bigger differences in intraoperative dural tears, which often isn't a long-term complication, but it adds about 45 minutes to repair intraoperatively. And this would be expected with the more nerve root retraction that you see in a fusion procedure. The reoperation rate is trending lower in the Limbaflex arm, and this is really significant because the whole justification for adding the fusion to the decompression or laminectomy is that reduces the reoperation rate and the symptom recurrence associated with the instability. So the fact that we're seeing already about a third less reoperations than the fusion arm is really strong and compelling for a new treatment. We have seen about a 5% spinous process fracture rate. So the Limbaflex device does attach to the spinous processes. And so this is unique to the Limbaflex as opposed to the fusion, but this is significantly lower than other spinous process-based devices, such as the Vertiflex Superion, the Paradigm Coflex, or the former Medtronic X-Stop, where those all had rates of about 20% in their clinical trials. Most of these spinous process fractures occurred intraoperatively, either during the decompression before the device was even placed, or during the device tensioning. So we've adapted our training to that. Our timeline, so we're really close to an inflection point for this project. We've been very capital efficient. We acquired all of our assets from a predecessor company. So for a PMA Class 3 device, we have a very low amount of money into this project. We are raising a Series B right now, so contact us if there's any interest. We can provide more details on that. But we're actually in the zone of an exit opportunity right now, and we're very engaged with several of the major strategics. A device like the Limbaflex really fits several of their strategic objectives. One of the bigger ones being devices that are compatible with ASC procedures, as well as motion preservation is a really big trend in spine. Patients often prefer an option that includes motion preservation as opposed to a fusion. And so here are some reference exits of other motion preserving technology and in a much more crowded space, whereas there's much less available in the lumbar spine right now. So here we are, and we will be submitting to the FDA about the end of this year, and then we expect approval toward the end of 2022, early 2023.
Great. Thank you, Louis, for your presentation and for telling us all about the Limbaflex device. We have some great questions, but I'm just going to start with one around, doing things differently is difficult for physicians, I know. So what do you think the barriers of uptake or use of this device by spine surgeons will be?
Well, I think you just explained it, that it's a new technology. And so surgeons want to do what's best for their patients. And I think understanding the data, and that's part of what we're doing now, is starting to publish our interim outcomes at scientific meetings. It is a new approach, and fusion for so long has been the best standard of care available for this disease. And there's good reasons for that the patients do better than they do with just a laminectomy. There have been several, disappointing new technologies in motion preservation, but, I think that our data will speak for itself in how well these patients have done.
Great. And like I said, lots of questions from the audience here. The first, is this for patients with unilateral laminectomy, bilateral laminectomy, or both? And then a follow-up question to that, because I understand that minimally invasive laminectomy is now also able to be done. So would this device work with the minimally invasive surgical method or approach?
Yeah, and I wish I could hand the mic to Dr. Alleman right now. He'd be great to speak to this. But it is compatible with most types of decompression. Laminectomy is kind of a loosely bantered around term. It would technically mean a complete removal of the lamina, which is rarely done anymore. More typically, there will be a laminotomy performed on one or both sides, and Limbaflex is compatible with either of those. So you basically need to retain at least half of the cranial caudal height of both the lamina of the segment, as well as at least half of the spinous process. And we've done a fair amount of biomechanical work in cadavers, loading spinous processes with straps in the way that we would. And we have a pretty good margin of safety on the loading in all of these settings.
Great. There is another question from the audience. How do you distinguish yourself from the Coflex device, which is an interspinous stabilization device, which can be used at an adjacent segment?
Yeah, that's a great question. So the Coflex was designed, it's got a fairly different mechanism of action. So the Coflex goes in between the spinous processes. And this whole category of devices were initially designed to sort of either fully replace or supplement the decompression itself. And by putting the spacer in between the spinous processes and prying them apart, that would open up the spaces around the nerve roots and either replace the decompression or somewhat assist it. We're not replacing the decompression at all. The surgeons are good at that. They were trained to do it in their fellowships. We're providing more stability in a postoperative setting by restricting flexion, which is the primary mode of instability that's associated with this disease, and maintaining the facets in a more engaged posture. Whereas the Coflex is kind of doing the opposite. By prying the spinous processes apart, it's actually somewhat disarticulating those facet joints, putting the segment in a more flexed posture where it's less stable in this disease. And so for that reason, we picked a narrower disease indication than a lot of spinal implants. And that was deliberate because we wanted a very specific population that this device would work well in and would help and wouldn't be for lack of better words, homeopathic. If a patient would do okay with only a decompression, that's all they should get. But these patients need some sort of stabilization, and that's what the Limbaflex is providing.
Great. So one question around, and I would love for you to talk more about the spinous process fracture complication, but there's another question from the audience on what are the long-term effects of that as well?
Of the spinous process fractures or of the device itself?
Yes. Nope, of the spinous process fractures.
Well, so it can go a few different ways. Some of the spinous process fractures are totally inconsequential if it's an avulsion of the tip that occurred during the decompression. That's not even structural to the implant, but it's still counted in our complications. If the spinous process fracture affects the fixation of the implant, sometimes they heal and there's no sequelae at all. If they are fractured to the point where they're displaced and the patient isn't getting the stability that the implant should have provided, it's essentially like they had a decompression without any sort of stabilization. And they may do well. The Limbaflex integrates really well with the fibrous tissues that run along the spinous process and the dorsal spine. And it gets incorporated, biologically, it gets incorporated into those fibrous tissues really well. So it essentially becomes a big bulky ligament. So some of these patients through that healing process are stable enough. In a very small subset, it would be like they had a decompression without any form of stabilization, and they could later have some symptom recurrence that might require additional decompression or stabilization.
All right, so a couple, I'm going to combine a couple of questions as our last question. So one, what % of fusions do you think can likely be replaced by procedures using this device? Secondly, can the device be used on multiple levels at the same time? And lastly, what is, given the lack of fusion, how long can patients go before they might need another procedure?
So the first one, how many fusions could be replaced by the Limbaflex? There's, depending on how you count it, we estimate between 300,000 and 400,000 lumbar fusions a year just in the US. Of those, somewhere between 40 and 50% are for degenerative spondylolisthesis. And we believe that about 85% of degenerative spondylolisthesis patients would be Limbaflex candidates. So that's about 150,000 patients a year in the US. And the patients with degenerative spondylolisthesis, the only ones who we feel would not be candidates for the Limbaflex are patients where Todd would describe it as a vertical foraminal stenosis, where the disc has collapsed to the point that you actually need a mechanical distraction device, such as an interbody fusion, to sort of restore the height of the spinal segment. Another way to think about it is that you have to be able to do an effective decompression surgically to relieve the trapped nerve roots. If you can't adequately decompress the nerve roots directly, then they're still going to have neurologic problems, even with the Limbaflex, and those patients probably would still need a fusion. But we feel that's a pretty small, that's about 15% of the degen spondy patients. So about 150,000 patients a year today in the US. Okay, the next one, what was the next one?
Can they be used on multiple levels at the same time?
Right, so we have the predecessor company that we acquired the assets from, of which Dr. Allen and I were both co-founders as well. We had experience in Europe in about 2,000 patients. We had a CE mark under that company. And we did treat up to 3 levels in Europe. It wasn't under a formal clinical study, but the surgeons who were using the device commercially and liked it got comfortable enough with it. They could implant it on up to 3 levels was what we saw. In the US, that would be a separate, subsequent IDE study, as we've seen with the cervical disc replacement devices, that they usually do a single level and then a multiple level study. Degenerative spondylolisthesis is mostly a single level problem. And so in our study, we allowed an adjacent level decompression in either the Limbaflex or the control group, but just a single level of stabilization. And then there was a third question.
How long can patients go before needing another procedure? And do you know that based on how far you followed your patients so far?
So it's mostly anecdotal. In Europe, we enrolled about 100 patients in prospective post-market studies under the CE mark. But they were only consented for 2 years of follow-up. But there are patients now who've had the Limbaflex for about up to 12 years, I believe. And we're in touch with the surgeons who were using it there, and they still, they patiently await its return, and tell us that their patients are doing well. So, kind of another line that I'm borrowing from Todd is that life is a stiffening event, and so a lot of these instabilities are transient, but transient on sort of a 10-year time frame, because eventually your body's going to get stiffer and the instability is less of a problem. So Limbaflex needs to get you through this period of instability before, the stiffening event proceeds. And we feel comfortable that it's durable for that.
Great. Louis, thank you so much for being here tonight and talking about Limbaflex. I know both Richard Treadwell and Dr. Allman are going to join us in the LinkedIn Pitch Club group, which you'll get a link to that in the follow-up email, so you can continue to ask additional questions. I know there were several that we did not get to in the Q&A, lots and lots of questions. You also can reach out to the team to ask specific questions as well, but we would invite you to join us in our LinkedIn Pitch Club group. And again, the link will be coming tomorrow in our follow-up email.
One of the things that's exciting about the Pitch Club is that we have a lot of people who are joining us tonight that are already members, but we've also opened this up to people who are not part of the AngelMD network. And, AngelMD is a network of both clinicians and startups, and we also have investors that are part of the network. And, we welcome you who are getting this first exposure to the network to actually become members. And that gives you an opportunity to get involved and engage with companies like this even more, whether it's demonstrating interest in these companies and choosing to follow them so that as they are making their progress, whether opening new rounds of funding or completing their FDA approvals, getting new IP, all of those are things that you can continue to get the updates about the companies. We also have opportunities for physicians to be clinical advisors. We've had opportunities too for clinicians to connect and work with companies to help them getting into their hospitals and organizations in order to do the clinical trials that will help keep these companies moving forward. So we invite you to join AngelMD. It's very simple to join. Just come on to angelmd.co and you'll be able to register. And there's 3 ways that you can register. You can register as a physician, a startup owner, or a investor. And
we're going to move on to our third company of the evening, and I'm excited to bring you Adi Dagan, who is the chairman and CEO of Agada Medical.
Stop share screen. Good evening, everybody. Thank you very much for the introduction. I hope I'm looking at the right screen right now. And yes, I think we are in business. So my name is Adi Dagan, co-founder and CEO of Agada Medical, a company that intends to revolutionize spine surgery by fully personalizing them, from the pre-op planning to the prediction of surgery outcomes to the tailoring of patient-specific implants, all in order to elevate spine surgeries to the success level that is associated with today's total joint replacements. And the need to come up with better results is most needed in adult deformity surgeries, where today's failure rate is anywhere between 20 and 40%. The failures are major ones, such as implant breakage, subsidence, PJK, failing to meet minimal clinical differences, adjacent level deteriorations, revisions, etc., overall leading to a doubtful risk-benefit of a major surgery. Agada's solutions are based on finding the root cause of these failures, and these are the forces acting in the patient's spine while it is moving. Following is a short video of our premise.
Meet MySpine Analytics, the world's first patient-specific digital twin simulation system that gives the surgeon a unique, never-before-available insight into the motion and forces acting along the entire length of the patient's spine. This insight is crucial to the decisions the surgeon is about to make. Should an artificial disc or a fusion cage be used? How many and which levels of the spine should be fused? Will the choice of implants arrest the progressive degenerating forces? And the most crucial decision, will this choice ultimately reduce the high prevalence of failed outcomes? MySpine Analytics software simulates the proposed surgical intervention and choice of implants and predicts how the different choices will affect the patient outcome. This transforms the surgeon's decision-making from a one-size-fits-all philosophy to a scientifically based, patient-specific, level-specific, preoperatively planned surgery with predictive outcomes. Agada's personalized solution goes further. Based on proprietary machine learning and its predictive capabilities, MySpine Analytics is able to tailor a patient-specific implant with the specific geometry and biomechanical attributes that will optimize the patient's spine function. The patient-tailored implant is then sent for proprietary 3D printing and becomes a truly personalized, optimal solution. Agada Medical. New insight, smarter decisions, tailored implants, personalized procedure. Agada Medical. Meet MySpine.
So what you just saw is not just a neat video or a science fiction. We are the first to derive the forces and base our solutions on analyzing and manipulating them. And we have a working prototype of our premise. Let's again use a short video to demonstrate what we were able to achieve to date. So we have built an accurate model representation of a certain patient's spine, and of that built a full digital twin. We derived and analyzed the forces and moments acting in it, simulated and predicted, in this case, the use of a fusion cage and an artificial disc commonly used. The arrows that you see represent the forces acting in the spine, such as shear forces, intradiscal pressure, and facet joint contact forces. When an arrow turns red, it means that the force exceeds the physiological thresholds of the ligament. And when that happens, we zoom in into in-depth analysis and see what it is exactly the root cause that causes the problem. Here with the cage, it was the intradiscal pressure at the index, at the level above the index, and with the artificial disc, it was the facet joints forces at the index level. The physician can then choose between the alternatives. In the next stage, we use this data to tailor a patient-specific implant with a geometry and biomechanical attributes that solves the pitfalls of the currently available cage and disc, and went on to 3D printing it. With respect to the competition, there is nothing close. We build a 3D digital twin they rely on using 2D images. We are doing a dynamic physiological analysis while they rely on static geometrical one. We build an implant tailored in shape and biomechanical attributes to the exact needs that the patient has, while the others are using generic implants. And there is still 20 to 40% failure rate in these surgeries, which we intend to reduce by at least 50%. A little bit about what we did so far. Agada was founded late in 2016, worked in stealth mode, actually up until now, changing focus from hardware development to software development until this stage where we reached a full working prototype of both. We have 1 patent applications on a programmable disc already granted, and 3 more pending, including one that is licensed from the Israeli Technion. We raised $700,000 as a seed round and are now in the midst of raising 5 in a round A, out of which we already have 2. Concluding this round will allow us to finish the development of the software and the cage, getting both to ready-to-market position, and have my disc ready for first in human in a couple of years. Reaching this milestone will position Agada as the world's leader in personalized spine surgeries, which in turn we believe will allow us to go through an IPO or an M&A at valuations higher than $300 million. This is not just a number thrown in the air, it is based on recent comps. And that is Agada in a nutshell.
Thank you, Adi, for being here tonight and sharing your company with us. This seems really exciting. So I have a couple of questions from the audience. I'm going to start with one of my own. What evidence do you have that this type of kinematic modeling leads to better results and improved clinical outcomes?
So we know that the model is working in real life out of the preclinical work that was done to evaluate it. Among these is a study that compared ground reaction forces as predicted by our model in comparison to gait lab data with excellent results. We also compared our model predictions to a work done by Dr. Wilke, in which he implanted pressure sensors in volunteers and measured the intradiscal pressure. And again, very good results there as well. And actually, we have quite a few preclinical studies, but of course, part of the funding will be used for a clinical study that will serve as the ultimate proof to the model accuracy, sensitivity, and its value.
Fantastic, thank you. I think this will be a quickie. What imaging studies are required to customize the solution and build that digital twin?
At least a CT, but the more information that we get, the more accurate the model will be. So CT, MRI, and if you have moving X-rays, that will be great.
Great. So there are a couple of questions related to spine motion forces. So one is around how are they measured? And then another question around kind of how are you solving for abnormal motion? And the follow-up question to that, are you obtaining dynamic CTs or just a static CT?
So I'll start with the later, just static CTs is enough. And what we're actually measuring are the forces that act through the spine, through the motion. So inflection, we can just tell the model to which degree to flex or to bend or to do an axial rotation. And that will be very much dependent on the physician and what he would like the model to check. And then currently there is a comparison to, again, thresholds that we know from the literature of what each segment can perform under. Other than that, we're also using a machine learning algorithm that will teach the system on a retrospective data what is the age-related, I would say, thresholds that are not currently available in the literature, but that's more into the future.
Great. One of our audience members is a little in disbelief, I think, about your claim that you can make a 50% improvement in failure rates. And so do you have any proof to support that claim?
No, unfortunately not. It's not a claim, it's a goal. And I believe I said it's our intention, but this is really our intention. I think that the failure rate right now is very high. And again, a doubtable risk benefit for a major surgery, and improving on that in a very high, this is our goal. And I don't see any reason that if you analyze the root cause, again, nobody's analyzing the root cause for the failure of the structures, and structures do fail because of their strength versus the forces that act on them, should not allow even a better correction, I would say, and better results.
Great. So another question, which I think is really important. So does the software only suggest the implants that you have created or 3D or are able to 3D print, or do the suggested implants include other commonly available implants that the surgeon can choose?
It includes all the common implants that are in the market.
Great. And my understanding is a surgeon could look at the forces, testing out multiple different types of hardware. Is that true?
Yes, that's very much true.
Okay, very good. So there's another question around adoption of this. So the question is, do you think it'll be difficult to get surgeon adoption of something like this, given that it's not currently the standard of care? And then a follow-up to that, can you talk a little bit about your physician education plan? Because that will definitely need to be part of your rollout.
Yeah, so again, the adoption, I have an experience of 22 years in this space, and physicians' adoption is always a challenge. Together with that, as far as we know and understand, there isn't any such tool that can really help the physician make those critical decisions that he's faced with. So that will pretty much depend on the clinical study results, I would say, in which we intend to really measure the value of the information that we provide to the physician and associate that information into a better decision making, meaning can they really predict and decide on a procedure and implants that will succeed better or will be driven to a higher success rate as opposed to failure, and that is embedded in the study that we intend to do. So a successful study, I believe, will will lead us to a faster adoption, of course.
Fantastic. All right. Well, thank you, Adi, again for being here tonight. We only have a couple minutes left, and we definitely like to end on time. So while we put up the last poll, and we would love for you all to participate in that, I'm going to let Jennifer give us some closing remarks.
Thank you, Katie. So first, I would like to thank everyone for joining us tonight. We know that you have very busy schedules, and so we appreciate you taking the time to come and hear the presentations. We also appreciate Hebe, Lewis, and Adi for the work that you guys did to really come prepared and to help show your companies to their greatest. We will be sending a follow-up email, which should be going out tomorrow for everyone who attended, as well as those that were not able to attend. And we encourage you to take the time to read it. We will provide ways that you can get access for more information about these companies or ways to connect with them. Katie mentioned earlier that we have a Pitch Club group on LinkedIn. Tonight, we had a unique experience that we had, our medical specialists were not actually able to be presenting, and there were a lot of good technical questions. And so they will be providing additional detail around some of your questions on that follow-up. And so we will provide a link for you to be able to join that group and get the answers to those questions, as well as be able to engage with previous and future companies attending or presenting at the Pitch Clubs. We'll also have some information on our Catalyst 2 fund, which is from our investment arm at AngelMD, where it's opportunities to be able to invest in these companies, as well as our clinical advisory board for people who are interested in having opportunities to more in-depth evaluate companies like this, as well as work more closely with us. And so a lot of information, but we want to make sure that you guys all have the information to engage to the extent that you're interested. So again, thank you for your time tonight, and thank you everyone for your great presentations. It's exciting to see the innovation that is happening.
And I would just say, join us in 2 weeks for Pitch Club on innovations in geriatrics, aging, and elderly care. Have a great rest of your night, everybody.